Hello, dreamers, and welcome back to the show. Before I forget, someone mentioned that some of the audio in some recent episodes sounded kind of off, like I had some humming or some feedback or something. I have no idea what happened. I haven't changed anything that I can think of, but I think it has stopped. Sorry about that. If I knew what to do to avoid it, I would, but I have no clue. So, yeah, I'll try to figure out what's going on and make sure that I don't have that issue in the future, but for right now, I don't know. Before we get into this episode, I have a few notes about this podcast. This is an independent show, which means I depend on the listeners to help keep the show growing, and there are a number of ways that you can help. You can leave a nice rating and a review, and this week I got a decently starred review. Well, it was a couple weeks ago, actually. But whoever it was went on to express their feelings about how I made fun of Southern accents. Like, seriously, I crack jokes here and there all the time about the way different words are pronounced all around the country. I have a feeling this has to do with the Montgomery County, Texas episode where I kept quoting the interrogator as saying y'all. Perhaps you haven't heard me make fun of my mom's Asian accent. I make fun of everything. And you know what? Working through my divorce and this 12-step program, I've been trying to be more sensitive. Like, I've realized a couple of things about myself, and I've tried to be sensitive from the beginning of the show, but it's a work in progress, and I'm learning. But still, I feel like I've been the same from the start. I know I've evolved and changed, and I've had good days and bad days, and it comes through in every episode. I know, like, I wear my heart on my sleeve, and it shows. You can tell in my voice and my tone, like, if I'm in a good place or not so good place. But anyway, you don't have to burden yourself with something like this. It's not that big of a deal. I don't mean to offend anybody. Sometimes when you've been through some stuff in life, you develop certain defense mechanisms, and this, I've realized, happens to be one of mine. I'm working on being less of an annoying person, but I also have to be willing to be unapologetic because I just can't please everybody. I don't have that kind of energy. So yeah, leave your reviews, and if you're mad or hate the show, you can do what that reviewer did and leave it under 5 stars, which felt kind of like a backhanded compliment, but I'm okay with that. So anyway, you can help the show by leaving nice reviews, like I say every week. You can follow me on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can recommend the show in true crime discussion groups and forums, and if you would like to go above and beyond, you can subscribe to Patreon, where for starting at $1 a month, you can gain access to dozens of episodes that you won't hear anywhere else. We are still in the middle of our series on the murder of Seth Jackson in Ocala, Florida. It's a long series because there are a lot of defendants, and there's some pretty good interrogations that I'm sharing with the patrons. I'm sorry, I have the hiccups right now, but I don't want to stop, so I'll try to stifle them. And that's kind of what I went ahead with this story that I'm telling you today. I wanted to do something kind of short and simple, sort of like the way the show was when I first started, since I have such a complicated series going on Patreon. So let's move on from this intro and delve into today's story. So I was looking through some cases on Investigation Discovery when I ran across a story that had some similar themes to the case of Seth Jackson that I mentioned a moment ago that we're currently working on over on Patreon. The cases took place in kind of the same general area of central-ish rural Florida. The suspect in this story today is also a teenager. In fact, when he committed the murder, he was the same age as the young man who did the actual killing in Seth's case. And in order to cover up the crimes in both cases, the victims' bodies were placed into fire pits on the properties that they were killed on. In both cases, very little was left of the victims, but neither suspect was able to completely burn the bodies down to ash. We all know how hot a fire has to be and how hard it is to completely burn a freshly deceased human body. Both murders took place within about a year and a half of each other, with this case today having occurred in late 2009. Another thing in both of these cases, while murder is often senseless, some are just more senseless than others. And in both of these cases, the reasons behind the killings are so petty, it only adds to the tragedy. But this story we're going to talk about today just might be one of the most baffling stories when it comes to the reasons why the victim was killed. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the people involved and then get into what happened. Doris Babcock was born in 1943 in Upland, Pennsylvania, to parents Ernest and Martha Jane Paul. She attended Pencrest High School. She was the captain of the lacrosse team. Following her graduation from high school, Doris enlisted in the Marines and trained as a nurse. She worked as a nurse in Fort Lauderdale during her enlistment and would later move to Ocala with her husband Cecil in 1992. At the time of her death in 2009, Doris had been married to Cecil for 17 years. Doris loved country music, tending to her garden, arts and crafts, and being of service to her community. She had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, and 5 grandchildren that she adored. She was 66 years old when her life was cut short by someone who she accepted into her heart and into her life as what could be described as a bonus grandchild, a very young and very troubled young man named Zachary Lee Snyder. While on a trip to Evansville, Indiana on November 14, 2009, Doris Babcock's 2 daughters, Sherry and Holly, received somewhat of a troubling phone call from Doris's husband, Cecil. He was a truck driver, and he was one of those truck drivers who did the long-haul type of work. So there were times when he would be gone for days and hundreds of miles away. Of course, Cecil and Doris stayed in regular communication while he was on the road, typically talking to each other several times a day while he was driving. So when he had trouble getting in touch with Doris for more than a day, Cecil became concerned. It wasn't like Doris to not answer the phone when he wasn't there, and he was sure that Doris would most likely be home at the time that he was trying to call. Doris always told someone if she had something to do or someplace to be. Worried, Cecil called Doris's daughters at the reunion and asked if they had talked to their mom. They said that they hadn't, but they also knew immediately that this was out of character for their mom to not answer her calls. So now everybody's worried. Cecil and Doris live in Dunnellon, Florida, and it just so happened that Cecil was several hours away driving his truck in the state of Kentucky. Both of Doris's daughters began trying to call her landline, but the phone would only ring a few times and send the call to voicemail. They tried Doris's cell phone too, over and over again, leaving several messages asking her to get in touch with someone as soon as possible, but nobody ever answered. Doris never called anyone back. In fact, Doris Babcock was never heard from or seen alive again. The evening wore on while Doris's family waited on pins and needles, hoping for that phone call from Doris to come in to let everyone know that she's okay, that this is all just some misunderstanding or whatever. Eventually, after nearly 2 days of not hearing from his wife, Cecil Babcock contacted law enforcement to report Doris missing. And you know, officers that investigate these kinds of cases see them usually work themselves out on their own. There's often some kind of explanation for the person having dipped out for a little bit, but generally, most missing persons are found in a relatively short period of time. Doris was in her mid-60s, so there was always the possibility that she was driving her car and it became disabled and she's stranded. Perhaps she got into an accident and is in need of help, Maybe she's entering into the beginning stages of dementia, considering her age. She could be lost somewhere or at a jail or in a hospital. And dreamers, I can't say that in all the times that I've heard people say that they've called local hospitals and jails, but they were never really able to locate their family or loved one. I never heard a case where they actually called a hospital or a jail and they're like, oh yeah, that person's here. But I guess if that's how the story ended, it's not going to be on the news for us to be talking about, right? So after Cecil called in his missing persons report, the Marion County Sheriff's Department there in Florida sent one of their deputies to conduct a welfare check at the Babcock home. At the time that this welfare check took place, it was nighttime. This was November, so it got dark early and it's very rural out there. It's very dark. The neighbors aren't in that close proximity to one another, so it's quiet too. The lead investigator on the case, who I watched in an interview on Investigation Discovery, said that the house was basically in the middle of nowhere. So with all of these circumstances, the late hour, the darkness, the isolation, and the silence, it was found to be unusual that there was clearly a cloud or a plume of smoke lingering in the air above and around the house. As the sheriff deputy made his way towards the home, he not only saw the plume of smoke rising from behind the home, he saw that some of the lights were on inside the house. So he tried knocking, but nobody came to the door. When he tried the door handle, it was unlocked, so he let himself in, and he quietly and carefully looked around. When he yelled out if somebody was there, he actually found a person in the house. But it wasn't Doris. It turned out that the person inside the house was a young man who identified himself as Zach to the deputy. This was Zachary Snyder. And at the time that this story took place in 2009, he was only 19 years old. When he was asked who he was to the residents of the home, he said that he doesn't live there and he's not a relative of the family, but said that he's usually around, that he's welcome in the home, that he used to live there, and he's very well acquainted with Miss Doris. The young man further told the detective that the reason he went over there was because of a concerning phone call that he received from Cecil asking if he knew where Doris was. Zach said that he also tried to get a hold of Doris but was unable to, so he decided to come over and check on her. The officer, suspicious at first, was a little bit more at ease as Zach continued to explain that Doris and Cecil used to be his guardians, so he's like family, but not actually related by blood. 4 years earlier in 2005, Zachary came to stay with Cecil and Doris. They had effectively taken him in, and he sort of became their unofficial grandson. For his entire childhood, Zachary was shuffled from home to home, shelter to shelter, institution to institution. And for whatever reasons and whatever circumstances, Zachary was apparently out there on his own, fending for himself by the age of 15, and he was on the verge of being sucked up into the foster care system. He appeared on the surface to be quite a normal-looking young man. He's kind of thin and lanky, blonde hair, very sharp, distinctive facial features. He appears to be a pretty decent, clean-cut looking teenager. The Babcocks felt sorry for Zachary. He didn't seem to have anybody else in the world that he could consider family or even a close friend. A young kid alone in the world really tugged at the Babcocks' heartstrings, especially Miss Doris. She, along with her family, felt as if that nobody deserves to be in a situation like that. That kids should have a stable home, a place to land, a place to put their heads down at night in a warm and loving environment. And for whatever reasons, Miss Doris kind of took Zachary in and basically unofficially adopted him into their family. All she wanted to do was to try and give Zach a stable home, and a fair shake at life. She didn't ever want to see him struggle or without a place to call home. In the interview with the lead detective that was assigned to this case, his name was Brian Spivey. Spivey or Spivey? I wish I knew how to say it. I'm going to say Spivey. He's actually very pleasant to listen to speak. He came across as so calm and clear in his interview and his interrogation of Zachary later on. When I looked him up, he's still with Marion County. He's now a captain of the Special Operations Division. But anyway, he said in his interview that Doris actually gave up her career and retired when she took Zach in. According to one of her daughters, all Miss Doris wanted was to be happy and to give back. And taking Zachary under her wing was something that was very fulfilling for her. If there was ever anything Miss Doris wanted to be remembered for, was being a good person and always willing to help others and to touch as many lives as she could during her time on Earth. God dang it. Sorry if you heard a little bell. That was my daughter's cat. I have her cat here. She has the dogs visiting with her in California. I'm going in about a week and a half to go and pick them up. So they'll be back and this cat will be not here bothering me anymore. There is rarely a day that I come home and there isn't something broken that this cat has pushed over or popped or done something destructive to. She's broken the blinds, she's torn up some sponges, she popped an air mattress. Now she's into my purse. Cat! Anyway, where was I? If there was ever anything Miss Doris wanted to be remembered for as being a good person, always willing to help others and to touch as many lives as she could during her time on Earth. And that's exactly what she was doing when she invited Zachary into her home. And for those first initial years, Zachary and Miss Doris did develop a close, strong relationship to a point where he did start calling her grandma. And Doris did the same thing, introducing Zachary to people as her grandson. Now, it had not been that long since Zachary had moved out of the Babcock home at the time the story took place. I believe it was approximately 3 weeks earlier. And it was Miss Doris who helped him secure the place of his own and got him all set up nearby. Zachary told the deputy who was there to do the welfare check that the last time he saw Miss Doris was the day before, and that would have been Friday. She had taken him shopping to Walmart to buy food and things for his new place. After they got back to his apartment, Zachary said that Doris hung out for a few minutes while he put his groceries away, and then she left. It was only after he received that phone call from Cecil asking him if he had heard from Doris did he become concerned. That's why he came over to the house, to check and see if Grandma was okay. Zachary said he looked through the house. He saw that her car keys were on the counter, and he saw her car, but he had no clue as to where she was. Zachary pointed out that because her keys were there, along with her car still parked at the house, that he grew even more worried because Miss Doris doesn't leave without her vehicle. She really can't leave without it because there isn't anything around that she would want or need to go to that's within walking distance. In an attempt to further satisfy the deputy's questions about his presence in the house, Zachary invited him to take a look around for himself. From his initial once-over, the deputy there didn't seem to think that anything was out of place. The house was relatively well kept and in good order. There did not appear that there was anything nefarious that had happened, no signs of a life or death struggle, at least not upon his initial entry. But the more Zachary showed the deputy around the house, the more this officer was seeing that there are actually some suspicious things going on inside in some other areas of the home. For one thing, in the master bedroom, a big, huge chunk of the carpet was gone, the carpeting and the padding. All that was left was a section of wood that used to be covered by carpeting. A portion of the carpet was cut out. The majority of the carpet was still in place, but there's just this one area that was missing. and it appeared as though whoever cut the carpet was in a rush because the cut was very tattered and uneven. As this deputy was leaning over, taking a closer look at the area where the carpet was missing, it was pretty clear that there were some reddish stains along the edges of the carpet where it was cut. But before the deputy had a chance to say anything, Zach himself said it. "That there looks like blood. Do you think something happened to Miss Doris?" The deputy took a closer look at the rug and near the area where it was cut, and there was indeed some reddish stains that did appear to be like blood. So the deputy finally decided that he was probably standing right smack in the middle of a crime scene, and not really knowing what to make of what he was finding, the deputy stepped outside and made a radio call for backup. Specifically, he wanted backup from the homicide division. Feeling uneasy about the scene, when the backup officers arrived, this deputy briefed them as quickly as he could about what he's found inside the house so far. When he was finished relaying that message, the two detectives began looking around the house and the property for themselves, including Detective Spivey. Well, he's a sergeant now, but I'm just going to be calling him detective because that's what he was during the time that this took place. The first deputy on the scene took the two homicide detectives to the bedroom where he found the cut-up carpet and the suspected bloodstains. When Detective Spivey's partner went into the room, she could see why the condition of it was so troubling to the initial deputy. Not only was the cut edge of the carpet tinged with blood, there were also very minute traces of blood spatter on the lower part of the bedroom walls. There was also a spray can of paint with some fresh paint on the wall that was still wet. The detectives were contemplating the scene, which was looking more and more ominous the longer that they stood there, wondering what it was that paint has covered up. What evidence are they seeing lost and destroyed right before their eyes? Blood that they could no longer see? Blood that could have helped tell the story of the last moments of Miss Doris's life? Perhaps. For Detective Spivey, the longer he was standing there inside the Babcock home, the longer he has to take everything that he's looking at in. It was as if every little thing that doesn't quite look right, the more and more he stood there, the more worried he was growing when it came to Miss Doris's safety and her well-being. The vibe that Spivey was getting is that something extremely violent happened, and they got there in the midst of an attempted cover-up. He stated in his interview that the hair on the back of his neck was standing up as he stood in that room. Spivey was on high alert and everything was giving him a really bad feeling. And it gets even worse when Detective Spivey made his way into the kitchen and the dining area, and he found that Miss Doris had left her purse behind. And next to her purse were her keys. The situation that they live in, the distances that they live out in the rural areas, you basically have to drive to get anywhere. There was just no circumstance where Miss Doris would have left without her purse, her keys, or her car. Of course, the blood spatter in the bedroom was troubling. And it's not just little bits of microscopic mist. There is very clear and visible blood on the walls that landed there with a measure of velocity. The whole scene became more chilling with every passing minute. As they continued to search the property, they decided to head back out to the location where that plume of smoke had been rising, the fire pit located in the Babcock's backyard. It was an ominous scene as everyone was becoming more and more consumed with dread. Of this, Detective Spivey stated, "The smell of smoke was in the air. It wasn't overpowering, but there was just this urge in me. I just wanted to go and see what's in the fire." In this area, according to the detectives, it was very common for these rural areas and these out-of-the-way homes to have fire pits. It's not unusual at all for residents to burn yard waste and whatnot, and trash and stuff. It's also cold that time of year, so it's even more common to have fires going. Detective Spivey and his partner stood over the fire pit, staring into the flames, attempting to make out the shape of anything that they could see underneath the backyard debris that was on fire. And they do see something underneath the debris. Everything in the pit had already been burned and blackened by the flames, but despite that, the investigators were able to see that there was some kind of large lump underneath it all. A lump that Spivey was very much drawn to. In fact, he couldn't take his eyes off of it. He and his partner kept looking at this formation in the fire, and then they would look at each other, and then they would look back at the fire. Eventually, what they finally saw just could not be unseen. And both detectives had a hard time even wanting to be the one to speak the words out loud that they were probably looking at what was left of Miss Doris. But it was evident that the lump in the fire had very distinctive elements and characteristics indicative of it being parts of a human being. So the investigators have got some questions for Zachary. In the process of questioning this young man that detectives discovered at the scene, I'm not exactly sure what their thoughts of this kid were initially, but he was their only source of information in person at that point. They asked him if it was possible that Miss Doris was with Cecil. Did she go on the road with him? Was Cecil ever known to be violent? And in answering these questions, this kid, he was calm, cool, and collected as he just sat there providing simple answers. His demeanor did not betray him. It did not appear at first that this person just spent the evening covering up a violent murder with arson. But anyway, Zachary basically said that he never really knew of Cecil to have a propensity for violence, but he pointed out that if someone said or did something to upset him, then yeah, anybody has the potential to be violent, right? So now that they're thinking that there is likely a dead body in this fire pit, the next order of business was getting that fire extinguished as quickly as possible so that they can all stop watching critical pieces of evidence go up in smoke. Because they were literally standing there staring at evidence in the process of being destroyed right before their eyes. But from there, the only way to definitively confirm that there are in fact remains of a human being in that fire pit is for the medical examiner to make his or her way to the scene to make that kind of determination. And then, if there are human remains in that fire pit, the next thing would be to make that official identification. So Zachary's story was that he saw Miss Doris one day earlier, stating that they had gone to Walmart together. She had taken him shopping for some food and essentials for his new place. It was only recently that Zachary had moved out of the Babcock home. It was actually kind of part of what Cecil wanted Doris to finish up doing while he was on this latest road trip. Get Zachary completely moved out of their home and into his new place and settled once and for all. And from the sounds of it, it doesn't sound like Cecil was all too pleased to have Zachary living in their home anymore at that point. By the time all of this had taken place in November of 2009, the Babcocks had been basically taking care of the teenager for about 4 years or so. As the two detectives were speaking to Zachary inside the Babcock home, they happened to notice that there were some suspicious stains on his clothing, stains that looked like blood. Zachary said that he got his pants dirty while tossing branches and things into the fire pit for Miss Doris, a chore that she typically had him do for her. Nothing unusual, and again, this kid was not nervous at all. It kind of makes you feel like he's completely disconnected from what was actually happening. Zachary explained that he had gone to the house to look for Miss Doris, a thing that, like I said, he decided to do after receiving that phone call from Cecil on the road that he wasn't able to get a hold of her. But then when Zachary got to the house, he didn't find Miss Doris. So as to not to waste a trip out there, he said that he decided to do a couple of chores that Doris had previously asked him to do, and that included burning some trash and yard waste in the fire pit, as well as fixing up a couple things inside the house. Yes, Zachary admitted it was him who started the fire, and that was that. As the detectives looked at Zachary, he didn't seem worried about what the police were doing there, nor did he seem to have an idea of what they think was actually burning inside that pit. Zachary's demeanor was very calm, too calm, perhaps. He did not appear worried about Miss Doris's whereabouts. As the detectives were sitting there looking at Zachary, it didn't make sense to them that this was their suspect. He was so young and quite innocent looking. If this was any other situation, they wouldn't have given this kid a second thought. But the fact that he was there just automatically put him in the investigator's sights. They can't help but think, who else is responsible for everything that they're finding at this house if not for him? He's the only one around, the only one to question, the only one to wonder about. He's admitted to setting the fire. However, is he responsible for the blood on the walls, the missing pieces of carpet, and most importantly, for Doris being nowhere to be found? Detective Spivey decided to reach back out to Cecil in an attempt to get a little bit more clarity about what was going on inside his home, specifically what's going on with this kid, Zachary. When the investigators contacted Cecil, he was still on the road hundreds of miles away, attempting to make his way back home as quickly as he could. When Detective Spivey told Cecil that he found Zachary on his property, Cecil immediately became very upset and agitated by his presence at his home. Things were not all hunky-dory between Zachary and the Babcocks, at least not as far as Cecil was concerned. Cecil told the detective that yes, he did call Zachary because he wanted to know if he was with Doris or if he had seen her. He did not ask him to go to his house. He did not want him going over there. In fact, Cecil didn't want him anywhere near his property. His exact words were, he's not allowed to be at the house. Something happened that caused a falling out between Zachary and the Babcocks. Cecil wanted him out of the home before he arrived back from this most recent trip, completely moved out. And Doris promised that she would have that done for him and have him settled in his new place. He wasn't even supposed to have a key to their house anymore. Now, as suspicious as it was that Zachary was at the Babcock home with all this weird stuff going on, it doesn't mean investigators aren't wondering about Cecil. After all, it's usually the spouse or the significant other that's responsible for these types of things when these things happen. And it does kind of look strange. I mean, Miss Doris goes missing coincidentally when Cecil's on the road. That's an alibi that's hard to poke holes in. We've seen it plenty of times before when someone tries their darndest to come up with an alibi, because of course nobody can be at two places at once. And a common one is, oh, I was at work, or I was out of town, or I was 100 miles away, all of which here apply to Cecil. So is he using Zachary as some sort of distraction here, a red herring, in order to cover up what he actually did? And how many times over the years have we seen the actual murderer make the 911 call to their own crime scene to play into their alibi? It happens a lot. Cecil's job takes him all over the country, giving him an unshakable alibi should something have happened to his wife. Well, for the time being, until they have a chance to speak to Cecil in person when he gets back to the area, the lead detectives on the case decided who was going to tackle what aspect of the case. So Spivey was going to go ahead and take Zachary down to the station and question him in an interview room where it could be audio and video recorded. His partner, Detective Rhonda Stroop, she's going to hang back and lead the processing of the scene and the evidence. Now, dreamers, if you're listening to the Patreon episodes on the murder of Seth Jackson, I think it was in the second interrogation audio tape that I played for you, where they spoke to the victim's ex-girlfriend. Her name was Amber Wright. When the detective came into the room to speak to her, she introduced herself as Rhonda. This is the same Rhonda investigating Doris's case that would go on to investigate Seth's case another year and a half after Doris's murder. She's the detective who kept asking about the bleach repeatedly to all the suspects in that case. So yeah, when she told those kids in Seth's case that she's had burning body cases before, I'm sure that this was one that came to her mind right away when she said that. It's interesting in this interview with Detective Spivey because he's so calm and so methodical, and he really gives you some good insight as to what's going on inside his mind and what he's thinking, what questions that he has that he wants to ask. And most importantly, he wanted up-to-the-minute updates as to what his colleagues, his partner, were finding at the Babcock property as he's sitting there trying to pry some answers out of a very reluctant Zachary. This is his thought process when he was driving with Zach to conduct the interview. He wanted to know what he had been up to the last couple of days. He wanted to know what Zachary knew about Miss Doris and what she had been up to as well. And he wanted to know when the last time Zachary actually saw Doris. As cooperative as Zachary appeared to have been at the time, Detective Spivey had seen enough red flags to know that there was going to come a point in time when he was going to have to go at Zachary with the hard questions. Detective Spivey knew that he was going to have to make that confrontation, and he wanted to know what, if anything, Zachary would have gained from doing something to harm Miss Doris. What could it possibly be? After everything that she's done for him, what is it that we are looking at here? There was some footage of the interrogation in the show that I watched about this case. I did look around on YouTube because I really wanted to see the whole entire thing. Detective Spivey, I think, did a really great job with this interview, but unfortunately I was unable to find the full video, so I'll share with you what I can. And Zachary, as soon as they walked into the room to sit down, he said to the detective, "I don't plan on being here for very long." I don't know what the context of that statement was because I didn't hear what Spivey may have said to him beforehand. It was cut or edited, but it sounds like Zachary may have been offered something like water or if he wanted to use the restroom, and this would have been his reply, "I don't plan on being here forever." Zachary was read his rights before the questions began. And the thoughts about how immature and youthful Zachary was, considering what they're thinking he's involved in, it was all a big, huge contradiction in and of itself, just sitting there talking to this kid. It just doesn't compute. It doesn't look like he's capable of doing what they think he did. And as young and as innocent and unassuming as Zachary seemed, he was really the best and only person the detectives had to speak with at the time, so he was really their best source of information, and Spivey was determined to spend as much time as he needed in speaking to Zachary in order to figure out what the truth was behind what happened in the Babcock home and what happened to Doris. Detective Spivey did notice that Zachary had some injuries on his hands. He assumed that they were burns since he had fessed up to starting the fire in the pit. And they showed some pictures of these cuts, and they kind of look like they're sort of tinged with like the edges burned. They could have been just turning black from dirt. I don't know, but the cuts did look kind of like burns. I could see why that mistake was made. But Zachary, he looked down at his hands and said no, and he pointed to one of the injuries and said he got that from the fire, but then he turned both of his hands, palms up, and said these aren't burns, these are cuts. So clearly Zachary had no idea how incriminating it was to have cuts on the insides of your hands. We all know what that means. Some stabbing event likely took place in order to produce those kinds of cuts, just across the inside of his hands and fingers. All 4 fingers were cut, lined up, like as if he had plunged a knife into someone, causing a major bleeding event to take place. That blood got on his hands, so when he went to stab, his hand slid down across the blade of the knife, causing all of those cuts. And he had it on both hands. In the video, Detective Spivey took a really close look at Zachary's hands. I mean, his face was just inches away from these cuts. And it appears that Spivey is fairly certain he knows what he's seeing. Zachary said the last time he saw Miss Doris was the day before. As stated earlier, she had taken him to the store. That was all a part of getting him set up at his new place. Then she took him home. She apparently helped him put some groceries away. She stayed for a few minutes, and then Zachary said that she sat down on the couch. They watched TV for a few, and he said, well, not a few minutes, it was more like 10 minutes before they parted ways. Miss Doris, he said, told him that she had to get going or whatever, and Zachary was like, all right, I love you, and out the door she went. And yeah, that's his story, and he was going to try to stick to it. When it came to Doris's daughters, they seemed already resigned to the fact that their mom was probably dead. Just based on the state of things and the way things were found, knowing Doris as well as they do, nothing about the scene at their parents' house made any sense other than something terrible happened. And the fact that Doris's car, purse, and keys were still there were only further indicators that not only had something terrible happened, it happened there at the house, and that Doris was there somewhere on the property, on or near the property. So getting back to Spivey's interview with Zachary, it was going along pretty well in the beginning, as the questions started off pretty basic. Zachary provided decent answers about himself and his background and the circumstances around him, having lived with the Babcocks for the past several years. Detective Spivey also asked about Cecil and Doris and the nature of their relationship. Did they have marital problems? Did they get along? Was Doris having any kind of extramarital affair since Cecil was gone all the time? But Zachary had nothing of the sort to say about the couple. In fact, when Spivey asked if Miss Doris had a boyfriend, Zachary said, no, dude, she's like 66 years old, man. And he kind of chuckled. And I guess it would be kind of weird to think of your grandma having extramarital flings, but hey, you got to ask, right? In taking a closer look at Cecil's alibi, when he made the call asking for that welfare check at his house, he was pulled over at a truck stop. In order to make sure Cecil was where he said he was, the detectives asked the local law enforcement to send someone out to that truck stop to verify that it was indeed Cecil that was hundreds of miles away at the time that this crime took place. And they were able to verify his alibi and his identity. Since he was quickly and easily eliminated as having anything to do with what is more and more appearing to be his wife's murder, the investigators were going to go ahead and press forward in taking a close look at their only other suspect, Zachary. After all, he was inside the house tending to that fire that was in progress, and you know that fire pit is probably going to have some revelations once they're able to start going through what's left in there. In his interview with Detective Spivey, Zachary let it be known that the years he spent living with the Babcocks from the time he was around 14 or 15 until all of this happened, it's like about 4 years or so, he said that these were the best 4 years he had ever experienced. He apparently didn't have a relationship with this family of origin for whatever reason. Nothing was ever really specified. I tried to look up court documents, but those things are more and more being placed behind a paywall. It actually depends on the state. So I really didn't get access to all of the finer details like I usually like to do. But for whatever reason, Zachary, by the time he was the age where he would have started high school, really had no place to call home and no family around him to support him, and was pretty much headed for the foster care system. Detective Spivey also suspected that there had been some kind of abuse in his history, but he didn't specifically say what type of abuse. In the detective's own words, he said, in the few years that he was with the Babcocks, Zachary experienced the love of the family for the first time. he experienced what a loving family looked like. But Spivey kept it at the forefront of his thoughts. He kept the concerning things that he was seeing going on here with Zachary as they sat in this room together. The stains on his clothing, the cuts on his hands, the fact that he's admitted to setting that fire. I mean, this kid seems to have no idea how utterly damning this evidence on him actually is. So Detective Spivey was just letting Zachary spin his tale. When he asked him about the cut on his hands, Zachary managed to come up with a story. He did have to sit there for a minute to think something up, but he said, "The cuts on my hands, it was, and he was silent like for 5 or 10 seconds before he said that he was gutting a shark. At that point, Zachary raised both of his hands up and made sort of like a downward swinging motion, as if you were splitting logs with an axe. And he made this chopping motion, and the detective pointed out that the movements Zachary was making to demonstrate how he cut his hands from gutting a shark was actually inconsistent with the motions you would be making if you were actually gutting a shark. Now, I've never gutted a shark, and I don't think I ever will, but I guess you're supposed to do this particular activity by having the shark hanging from I don't know what it's called, a rig or whatever. You'll know what I'm talking about when someone catches like a large fish or a shark or something and they hang it in order to measure and weigh and take pictures. Yeah, that's what I gather from this episode when it comes to how a shark might be gutted. If anybody has any other ideas, please share. Zachary made this downward motion towards the ground, kind of like a chopping movement. So his words were not lining up with what he was pantomiming. He said that he was gutting a shark, but he forgot to wear gloves. But on top of that, Zachary said that he didn't know what he was doing, so he accidentally sliced his fingers. And then he went quiet and he silently stared at the injuries to his hands in front of him. And you could almost see the air get sucked out of that interrogation room. It solidifies Detective Spivey's suspicion that Zachary had recently stabbed someone. The blood on his clothing, the cut on his hands, and the manner in which he demonstrated how he gutted a shark. Yeah, Spivey's pretty sure that this kid stabbed somebody. This time, Zachary was betrayed by his body language, his movements, and his gestures. As much as Detective Spivey wanted to just make the accusation that he believed Zachary murdered Miss Doris, he's not quite ready to jump over to that just yet because he wants to talk to Zachary about the fire pit first. Zachary said that after he got the call from Cecil, he went over to the house to check on Miss Doris because he was worried. He didn't see her there, so he decided to pile up some trash, some old magazines, and lawn debris. He threw it all on the fire pit and started the fire. During the course of this conversation with Zachary, Spivey did receive a text that confirmed that there were human remains in the fire pit. The majority of a human torso was pulled from the pit. The medical examiner was able to see the distinctive bone shapes of the human vertebrae. Once Spivey had that information, he was ready to start confronting Zachary about the human body in the fire pit. The fire pit that Zachary admitted to starting the fire in. And this suddenly switched from an interview to a full-blown interrogation, and Detective Spivey was determined to get the truth out of Zachary, however long it took. Spivey told Zachary straight up, "Look, I already know what was in the fire." Zachary defiantly replied, "What's in the fire?" He shot back quickly, "She is, okay?" Right away, Zachary goes into the denials. He did not put Miss Doris in that fire. And Spivey said, "You're the one who started the fire." Zachary repeated, "I didn't put her in the fire. I threw freaking 3 or 4 bags of garbage on it and lit it up. That's all I did. I didn't put her in there." And it's not the denials that are really having the detective thinking about what really happened, but rather Zachary's manner of completely ignoring and glossing over the fact that he was just told that Miss Doris was in the fire pit. He had no reaction, no shock, no fear. He wasn't horrified, upset, crying. None of the quote-unquote normal reactions that people have when they are told this kind of news. We do often hear that investigators look for typical reactions to death notifications, and we've heard that everyone reacts and grieves differently. And this guy is only 19 years old, and it does sound like he's been through some trauma. But realistically, the evidence that's already been discovered, it's pretty obvious that Zachary was involved in what happened to Miss Doris. So that being said, why would he have a reaction to the news, considering he's the one that made Miss Doris that way? Watching him in these interrogation clips, it's clear that Zachary is not connected to what's happening around him, completely detached. And Detective Spivey kept going because he wanted that confession. Spivey leaned in so hard into Zachary's personal space, telling him to his face he needed to do the right thing right now. But Zachary continued to insist that he didn't do it. Spivey said, "I know you were looking straight at her face." Zachary repeated, "I didn't do it." Spivey said, "I know you're looking straight at her face." Zachary again said, "I didn't do it. I put those 3 bags on top of the..." And Spivey cut him off and said, "The reason you cut your fingers is because you were trying to drive that knife straight into her body. And the knife stopped, and your hands kept going, and sliced your fingers open. I'm not an idiot, Zach." Zachary said, "No." Spivey continued, "I need you to do the right thing right now, Zach." Zachary said, "That is not what happened." Spivey kept going. "Did she beg for her life? Did she ask you to stop?" Zachary then rested his forehead onto his hand and cast his eyes downward. "Did she ask you why? Did she look you in the eye when you were pushing a knife into her and say, 'I forgive you'?" Zachary insisted, "I didn't kill her." The detective continued to dial up the pressure. "Is there something that she did to cause this?" "She didn't do anything to me." "Was this self-defense?" "That lady took care of me." "Was this self-defense?" "That lady has taken care of me for 4 years." "Then why did you do this to her, Zach?" He insisted, "I didn't do anything to her." While this interrogation of Zachary Snyder was going on, Doris's remains were being collected and processed. In addition to all the evidence found in the house and in the yard, in the fire pit, investigators found a critical piece of evidence in a trash bag that was inside Doris's vehicle. In her vehicle was a black Jeep. It was a smoking gun, you could say. It was a knife from the Babcock's kitchen that had blood on it. Even more chilling is that you can see the very, very tip of the knife is crooked and the whole blade is bent, which was believed to have happened when this knife was plunged into Miss Doris and it struck bone, causing Zachary's hands to slip down the blade. Both of his hands were sliced on the inside of his fingers. When he made the motion when describing how he was gutting a shark, Zachary was using both hands, pretending to hold the knife and bringing it down in a stabbing motion towards the ground. Detective Spivey said that as Zachary was describing gutting a shark, he made gestures that were more in line with literally stabbing someone who had already been injured and fallen to the ground. The detective believed that Miss Doris was on the ground when Zachary attacked her. Spivey continued to apply pressure on Zachary, which he described as his interrogation technique. Keep up the pressure, keep up the stress, and get them to confess. Spivey was very methodical, even-keeled, and I would even say calming as he spoke to Zachary. I liked his approach a lot. But Zachary, despite Detective Spivey's even and calm demeanor, he continued with his denials, telling the detective that he didn't stab her. Spivey asked, "How many times did you stab her?" "I didn't stab her." "How many times did you stab her?" "I did not stab her. I did not stab her." "What did you do to her? Did you strangle her?" Zachary seemed to have had enough when he next said, "Can we just stop doing this?" Spivey replied, "I'm not doing anything, Zach." "Yes, you are. I'm asking you for the truth." Zachary said, "You're not going to get the truth because I've already told you." Spivey could tell that Zachary was feeling the immense amount of pressure that he was putting on him with the rapid-fire questions that he was lobbing. Zachary wouldn't even make eye contact with the detective, continuing to look down at his lap or towards the ground. Spivey was feeling as if he was starting to get to him. He just needed to keep up the pressure a little bit more. Detective Spivey next asked, "These memories haunt you, don't they?" Zachary quickly shot back, "No, they don't. I didn't do anything." "Did she beg for you to stop?" "I did not do anything." Spivey stated that he was trying to bring Zachary back to the moment that Miss Doris was dying, hoping that this would be his breaking point, where he would finally just come with the confession. "Did she tell you that God loves you?" "What did she say as you were pushing that knife into her?" "What did she say? Or did she just scream?" Here, Zachary finally changes his strategy by stating, "Your questions are bleeping hilarious. These are hilarious." Spivey replied, "They're dead serious. I'm dead serious." He wanted to know if Miss Doris had any last words that she uttered as she took her last breath. So he was trying to think of anything that could come to mind that might trigger a reaction out of Zachary. But it started to feel like the detective wasn't getting anywhere. Zachary's defenses were up, and now he's resorting to laughing at the detective's questions in order to avoid having to come up with answers. Zachary then said, "That lady is the nicest lady you'll ever meet." "Then why did you kill her?" In the video, as Zachary supplied his answer to this question, he's just looking off to his left, up towards the wall or the door of the interrogation room. "I didn't kill her. That would be the last thing I'd do in my entire life." Despite Zachary's denials, the evidence against him was damning. He was at the house when police showed up for the welfare check. He admitted to setting the fire in the pit where Miss Doris's remains were found. The cuts all over the inside of his fingers, the bloodstains on his clothing, and the bloody knife found in the Jeep. Detective Spivey kept trying for a little while longer, but he was getting to the point where Zachary was just going to continue to deny any involvement. Finally, Zachary, also getting tired and frustrated at Spivey's persistence, demanded that Spivey prove it, prove I killed her, prove it, you're so effing, I can't even effing think straight. Detective Spivey reiterated, "I'm looking for the truth." But at that point, he was starting to think that Zachary was about to invoke his rights to an attorney. But as Zachary spewed this challenge for him to prove it, Spivey sensed that there might be a way to get Zachary to crack finally. And that would just be to point out the immensely strong amounts of evidence that they have against him, specifically the evidence right there in front of both of their eyes, the stains on Zachary's jeans, the cuts on his hands. Spivey looked at the blood on his pants and said, "That's blood on your pants. Is it going to be yours or hers?" Zachary started to look at his pants and rub his pant leg with his hands, insisting it wasn't blood, that it was dirt. "It's not blood." Spivey pointed to another stain and said, "What about that? What's that?" Zachary said, "That's not blood either." He looked at the other stain on his pants that Spivey pointed to and paused and said, "That might be blood, because it's clearly blood. It's red and it looks like blood." His jeans were a light colored blue, and they showed photos of the stains, and yeah, it's blood. Detective Spivey next said, "Zach, that's blood. Her blood is all over the floor. Her blood is all over your pants." Zachary defiantly said, "So what? It doesn't mean I killed her. It doesn't mean I dragged her into the fire. It doesn't mean I burned her." So Zachary isn't cracking, and Detective Spivey had been down this road in interrogations before. And a common thing to happen is for the suspect to come up with a lie and to just stick to it, even in the face of undeniable, irrefutable evidence. Zachary at that point brought up the fact that he was aware of his rights and that he doesn't have to tell you a damn thing. So Spivey, sensing that the interview was about to come to an end before he was able to elicit a confession, just as Zachary was about to bring up knowing his rights and whatnot, but they were just going around and around in circles, and the detective couldn't keep doing this forever. So Spivey decided to go ahead and let Zachary know that he would be going to jail after this interrogation was over, and he was going to be charged with Miss Doris's murder. Spivey was confident that they had enough evidence for an indictment. Zachary asked, "Why am I still here?" And Spivey said, "Because you're under arrest." "Then arrest me, put some handcuffs on me." And Spivey replied, "Handcuffs don't mean anything. I'm telling you, you're under arrest." And Zachary replied, "Good." And Spivey replied, "You're not free to go. You're not going home. Do you understand that?" Zachary again defiantly replied, "I bet you I am, because I didn't do a damn thing." Zachary, at that point, still hadn't brought up wanting an attorney yet, but Spivey could tell that the needling with all of the questions was kind of working. Zachary was getting agitated, and Spivey asked him if he wanted a few minutes to himself. And Zachary told him that nothing's going to change his mind, that he just wanted to be alone. So Detective Spivey opened the door, and he's actually waiting for the evidence people to come into the room to collect everything from Zachary. His clothing, take some swabs, DNA, fingerprints, all that stuff. Detective Spivey left the interrogation room, at which point Zachary started to take a closer look at all the bloodstains on his jeans again. He started to try to take his shoes off, and he's talking to himself while he's looking at the bloodstains on those too. And he said, "I got blood on there because I was all up in that fire." So they're watching Zachary in this room mess with the evidence that's on him, and they're worried that he's contaminating it or somehow compromising it. So they want to get in there and quickly get their hands on his possessions. When Spivey came back into the room, he knew what was up. He knew that he got Miss Doris's blood all over himself, so Zachary stood up and he went face to face with Spivey. They're about the same height, but Zachary's very wispy and lanky looking. It looks as if the detective could snap Zachary into two pieces if he had to. And that's when Zachary said, "I want a lawyer." This was Zachary's attempt to stop the investigators from taking his clothing, however. And Spivey tells him, "You can have a lawyer, but you're still going to give us." And then there was a pause and Zachary cut him off. And he goes, "You don't have the right to take any of my clothes with my lawyer without my lawyer being present." He clearly doesn't know how getting booked into county jail and put into a jumpsuit works. They'll take your clothing, whether there's evidence on it or not. But Spivey is up in his face too, and he's pointing his finger at him, getting in his face, telling him, Zach, I'm going to take your clothing." And Zachary tried again, "You're not taking my clothes." And Spivey was like, "I'm taking your clothes." And Zach again argued like a child, "No, you're not." And then Spivey motioned for the officers at the door to come and place Zachary in handcuffs, and that officially ended his interrogation. Zachary was taken into custody and subsequently charged with murder. The remains were later positively identified as being those of Miss Doris. In the documentary that I watched about this, it said that as soon as Doris's daughters arrived at their mom and stepdad's property, they made their way over to the fire pit solemnly. It was the only way that they felt like that they had left to connect with their mother. This was the last place that she was, in a place where they didn't get to see her, they didn't get to say goodbye. Being at the fire pit was their way of being able to do that, to have that closure, if that's even possible, stating, "We stuck our hands in the fire pit just so we could feel a part of her." The collection of evidence at the Babcock property continued into the following day, and what they discovered then was just as shocking, if not more so, than what they found when they first arrived to check up on Miss Doris. They also discovered the motive behind the murder, but I'll come back to that in a few minutes. One of the items that was pulled from the fire pit was Miss Doris's wedding ring. It was messed up and charred, but it survived. Prior to Doris's funeral, the detectives took it upon themselves to have the ring polished, cleaned and restored, and they were able to return it to Cecil, who had on his own finger the match to their wedding set. And you know, dreamers, those of you who are patrons, you've been listening to the Seth Jackson series. You've heard Detective Rhonda Stroop's voice, and you've listened to my interrogation recordings. She's a pretty firm detective, but in this interview, when she's talking about Miss Doris's ring, you can see that this case impacted her emotionally. She said it was the least that they could do since there was nothing left to give them of Doris. This interview was conducted in 2018. The murder had happened 9 years earlier, so, you know, these officers carry a heavy burden with this job that they do, and I respect it. Every once in a while, we hear about a detective returning a personal item to the victim's family. But we don't hear these stories all that often, and these detectives, they do this every single day. In Florida, no less. And then a year and a half later, Detective Rhonda has another burned body in Marion County in another fire pit, thanks to the kids in that story. I wondered as I was writing this if the 6 convicted of murdering Seth Jackson, if any of them got the idea to burn this body from hearing about this story, because it was similar in some aspects of the case, especially when it came to how petty the motives were. One of the places that was searched the day after Doris's body was found was the apartment that she had set Zachary up in. She had done all of that work for him, getting him a place, getting him settled, getting him groceries and things that he needed. And when he turned around and did that to her, unthinkable. When the investigators searched through Zachary's garbage, they found 3 pieces of paper that had been torn out of a spiral notebook and crumpled up in the trash. And it turned out Zachary is a list maker and a note taker. This was a to-do list for murder, and the very first thing on the list was kill Mrs. D. And there they have their premeditation. When the bent and bloody knife was tested for DNA, the results revealed a mixture of both Miss Doris's and Zachary's blood. Confirmation that it was indeed Zachary who murdered the woman who had pretty much taken him in as her own grandson, the woman he called Grandma for at least 4 years. Of course, the news was devastating. Everyone knew Zachary was troubled. That was the reasoning behind the Babcock's decision to move him into his own place. What specifically Zachary was doing that caused this rift in his relationship with Doris and Cecil wasn't really revealed, but I have a theory on that based on a letter that was found amongst his belongings. But considering that Zachary up and resorted to murder, it speaks to the depravity of his thinking. I don't know what happened to this kid. I kind of wish I did, but I wasn't able to find that specific information. All Doris's daughters would say is that their mom thought that anybody could be helped or saved with just the right person to love and care about them. Helping Zachary was fulfilling for Doris. And look at what her efforts got her. It's so sad. Almost 3 months after Doris's murder, on the very last day of January of 2010, Zachary asked to speak to someone about his case. In the time that he had had to sit in the Marion County Jail, Zachary reached the conclusion that he wanted to confess to Doris's murder, but in exchange, he wanted to be sentenced to death. The death penalty doesn't really work that way. The only people who can sentence someone to death is a jury, if I'm not mistaken. If I'm wrong, let me know. But he would have had to have been convicted of capital murder, and the penalty phase of the trial would have to be heard by a jury anyway. The prosecutor can't make deals that further the death penalty as the sentence. They can only deal it off the table. When Detective Spivey got word that Zachary was ready to talk, he was very excited and made his way over to the interrogation room straight away so he could try to get that confession while the getting was good. This time, Zachary was wearing an orange and white striped shirt and khaki-colored pants. Spivey was sitting right across from him again, taking copious notes. And Zachary, he still won't make eye contact with the detective. He's still hanging his head down, still staring at the floor as he began to talk. I already know the evidence that's against me. I killed somebody. You're gonna kill me. I still don't understand why I did what I did. My mind's wanting to tell me greed. I honestly haven't figured it out in my head. Like, why? Detective Spivey asked, "How many times do you think you stabbed her?" Zachary replied, "She came out of her bedroom. I was waiting right there, out of her room. And it was once, and she fell to the ground. And I didn't want it to be like pain. I didn't want it to be painful. I didn't want it to be slow." And we do actually get the answers as to why. Why would Zachary kill Miss Doris after everything she did for him? Well, Zachary explained that in the days leading up to Doris's brutal murder, he had met a young woman that he was interested in taking out on a date. When he tried talking to this girl, he told her that he owned a black Jeep, the car that was actually Doris's. He told this girl this white lie in order to impress her. So he was going to have to ask Doris if he could borrow her car. And it was something that Doris was not likely going to allow him to do, considering they really weren't on the best of terms in their relationship. After all, Zachary was just moved out of the Babcock home under what seemed to be not the best circumstances. So instead of asking Doris, Zachary's plan B was to just kill her and use her car to go on this date. And afterwards, he came back and began his cover-up. Detective Spivey helped Zachary to understand why he did what he did. Now you've got a dilemma. You don't want to ask Miss D to use her car because she will probably say no. So you're fighting yourself internally, back and forth. I know what I gotta do. I don't want to do it. I know what I gotta do. I don't want to do it. So finally, it's getting close to time. You gotta make a decision. So you get one of the kitchen knives. At that point, Zachary did what he had done in the conversation that he had with Detective Spidey early on. He started laughing. I don't think Zachary thinks this is funny at all. He's actually a pretty serious young man. But I think this just plays into his age and maybe whatever trauma he's experienced. I kind of thought about this a lot recently myself when filling out my statement of facts for my divorce filing. And I realized how much I came to dislike my soon-to-be ex-husband. And a lot of times I used joking and laughing and sarcasm as some form of defense mechanism in dealing with all the pain and hurt that he had put me through over the years. I'd sometimes make fun of my ex-husband, but it would really be me low-key taking personal jabs at him and then covering it all up with a "just kidding," when the truth was I was really feeling those insults and jokes. Zachary stated, "Excuse my laughing, but it's just funny how my effing, like, the way my brain thinking at the time, and I can't help but effing laugh at it." And Spivey replied, "Am I describing it pretty accurately?" And Zachary said, "Yeah, you are. More better than I can. You're helping me understand this too." At that point, it cut to Spivey's interview, and he actually expressed his opinion that in that moment when Zachary had this sense of clarity about why he did what he did, Spivey believed in Zachary's genuine remorse for what he had done, which is a thing we so very rarely hear from investigators. He further stated, Zachary realized that he made the biggest mistake of his life, and he did it to the one person that cared about him. You can hear it in his voice cracks and shakes. And he followed that up by saying this case had to be one of the most senseless crimes he had ever been assigned to as a police officer. Detective Rhonda Stroop, she wasn't feeling as sympathetic to Zachary as Spivey was. She stated, "I can't tell you enough how evil he is. and I personally believe that given the opportunity, he would do it again. In the end, Zachary did not get the death penalty. He was going to have many years of appeals to go through, so they ended up working out a deal 2 years after the murder. Zachary pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was given a life sentence without the chance of parole. In the end, Zachary's attorney said it was his client's wishes to not put the family through a lengthy trial and appeals process. As I said, the Babcocks had only secured that apartment for Zachary about 3 weeks prior to the murder. Doris was discovered burning in that fire pit on the night of Saturday, November 14th, 2009, going into the early morning hours of Sunday, November 15th. The Thursday prior to the murder, Doris had taken Zachary to church with her. On Friday, the 13th, they had gone to the Walmart together to get him some groceries and some things for his new place. It was sometime after that Walmart trip that he killed Doris. Zachary went out on that date either on Friday or Saturday and was caught in the middle of covering up the murder the following day. Upon the search of his apartment, investigators discovered a letter that Miss Doris had written to Zachary. I looked for the transcript of this letter, but I couldn't find it online. However, I was able to see parts of it in the documentary. It read in part, "Dear Zachary, I hope everything is as good as you had hoped for. I know you don't have everything that you want, but if you did, what would you have to look forward to? I pray for you. Not that you will get everything you want, but your eyes will be opened to what Cecil and I have given you. I am sure that you do not want to hear all this God stuff, but sooner or later you will have to admit he has been better to you than you deserve, at least the last few years. I think you would have a hard time finding someone that was happy with the way that they grew up. Some may have it better, but a lot have it worse. I wish I could have done more for you. You want so much. You will never have everything because there will always be newer and better things coming out all the time. I believe you are looking for things to make you happy since the people in your life have caused you so much sadness that you don't let anyone in to fill that hole that was made so long ago. Cecil and I wanted to, but we were two broken people wanting to fix another broken person. For that, I need to ask for your forgiveness. We need God to help us fix us, and you need God to help you fix you. We do love you, and hopefully someday you will be able to understand that. We never adopted you legally, but we adopted you in our hearts. And like God, that can't be taken away. I have been mad at you, didn't even want to speak or see you, but I have always loved you and I will pray for you to the day I die. I have forgiven you for the things you have done to me, even the ones that I don't know about. I'm not happy about what happened, but God has forgiven me much, so I forgive you. That was about all I could see of the letter in the TV show that I watched about this. And like I said, I don't know what was at the center of this falling out between Zachary and the Babcocks, but if I had to take a guess, I'd say he probably stole from them and got caught. More than once, probably several times. He probably stole from them a lot without them even knowing. Just the way Miss Doris said that Zachary keeps wanting and he is never happy. It's so very hard to win back trust after that kind of betrayal. And it probably happened and the trust was broken and there was just no going back. And like Doris said, he probably did more than she knows of. Sadly. And paid for it with her life. And that, Dreamers, is the story of the murder of Miss Doris Babcock. I want to thank you all so much for listening. The July Patreon bonus will be out next. Many of you who are patrons should be receiving a package from me in the mail soon. If you don't, in a couple of weeks, send me a message or an email and I will take care of you. I got all of your message with all of your mailing information if you replied to my messages to you on Patreon. All right, that's all I've got for this week. I will be back soon with the next episode, and I am your host, Roseanne. As always, take care. I love you, and sweet dreams.